going to be talking to us, and I have a question for you, Barry. So Europe has been facing increasing challenges of how migrant, refugee, and host communities relate to each other, and this has been exacerbated by the global pandemic. Could you talk to us especially about the role of teacher education in terms of how to live together, and the kind of recalibrating that we need to do now that we're facing a global pandemic? Over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Laura, and arigatou gozaimasu, arigatou. Suchit, if you could pull up my PowerPoint, please.
Yes.
So thank you, everybody. We all have to keep this extremely short. I'm sorry about that. It's easier for us to speak for 20 to 30 minutes than 6. So apologize the speed of which I'll be going through this. The next slide, please. Now, one thing I think that needs to be emphasized from the very outset in many discussions, what people talk about is basically a deficit, that there is a real problem. And people talk about problems instead of challenges, but I think it's important to frame the entire discussion. If we look at what's happening in an intergenerational arena, we can see that as a whole, that migrants and refugees, and they are different groups, but as a whole, they're upwardly mobile throughout Europe. We're talking specifically here about Europe, but they are not reaching their full potential at the moment. And especially upwardly mobile if you compare between generations. So there is progress being made, despite many conversations that only talk about problems. What we do know is that if you look at least at the European level, that there is a higher risk of ESL, which is early school leaving, and NEET, which is not in education or employment. And that the EU has been trying to reach less than 10% of individuals who come from these backgrounds, especially from these backgrounds leaving school. That is at the moment higher than, let's say, the native population. And due to the global pandemic, we know that the early school leaving and school disengagement has increased. I have here that gender matters, that in general, if you look at least at the European situation, that in general, boys tend to do worse than girls at the moment in terms of performance in schools. However, among these populations, if we're talking about migrant and refugee students, that it's the girls who don't perform as well as boys. This also means that perhaps a different kind of intervention, especially at the school level, and in terms of how teachers are educated and how teachers perform in schools, that something needs to happen there. Now, the next point, that teachers are not well enough equipped to deal with diversity in classrooms and society, that is a common perception, and that is true. And it is also something to be mentioned that this is what research finds, but this is also what teachers themselves indicate. If teachers are asked, teachers who work in diverse environments, what their main challenges are, they will often indicate that they feel that they have not had enough background, not enough training, not enough information, both in their training to be a teacher and in their daily experiences and in the kinds of teacher education that takes place as they move forward. The issue of faith and beliefs. In intercultural education, this is oftentimes ignored. I think that will be part of the discussions that will take place here. There are many different reasons of why faith and beliefs, and both need to be mentioned, also non-religious belief systems, why those tend to be ignored in education in almost all countries. Oftentimes the solution is seen in terms of developing teacher competence, and I think that I'd like to, in this presentation, focus on some of the challenges and also some of the problems with some of these words. That competence is too often seen as, okay, I have now developed the competence. I now know how to deal with this kind of issue. It is important that competence is an ongoing phenomenon, that lifelong learning needs to take place. So it's not whether you do or do not have a competence, but how do you constantly strengthen that? How do you constantly improve that? As the last point here, I have, and this is found throughout that if you look at and this is pretty much across the globe, if you look at teachers in schools, how many of them actually come from the same background as the students who might be a migrant or a refugee. And what you find is there is a disproportionate number of teachers that do not. For the most part, teachers tend to come from well, let's say in Europe, they're white, they're middle class, and they are women. And for the most part, that is not the case for migrant and refugees. So there's a problem there. And unfortunately, I also have to say that the evidence is showing that in the future, this is not going to change very much. There are very few individuals who come from these migrant and refugee communities who will become teachers. And there are various reasons for that. Perhaps that will come up in the discussion. Next slide. Okay, solutions. I have here, it is of course important to recognize the background of migrant students, their language awareness, culture, and history. However, we need to go beyond just recognizing that background of migrant students and refugee students, that these backgrounds need to be activated. And that is the big question mark. Not only recognition of the language, culture, and history, but how do we activate that in a classroom? That's a big question mark. And I hope that comes up in the rest of this discussion here. Empowering the students, not just making sure that their histories are told, but that they are empowered to take an active role in the learning that takes place in the classroom. Now, if we're talking about teachers, teachers tend to be oriented towards their subject area. They tend to learn about their subject area. They tend not to know very much about how do you engage in peer learning among the students? How do you actually empower students to take an active role in their own learning? Tackling subtle bias, what does that mean? What we see is most evidence shows that teachers are not necessarily bigots. However, they do tend to hold very subtle biases that they are oftentimes not even aware of. And that means that they have a certain sense that their own culture or their own religion is somehow more superior than those of the students in the classroom, especially if they have a different religion, a different culture than the teacher might have. But students tend to be very aware of the fact that something is going on. They can't always place it, but if there's a subtle bias, it does have a major impact on the student. So obviously, professional development of teachers is needed. And what we also see is that in that professional development, if future teachers, so pre-service teachers, have the choice of where they go for their internships or placements, they prefer not to work in diverse environments. This is, of course, a task for teacher training institutions, teacher colleges, and for policymakers to try to push a situation where those that will be future teachers learn how to work in diverse environments. Too often in diverse environments in schools, the teachers have very little experience working in those environments, and they themselves grew up in very monocultural environments for the most part.
Barry, I'm giving you your 1 minute warning.
All right, there's my 1 minute. All right, obviously too often, migrant communities are not involved in what happens in the school. Too often schools are seen as separate from the community, but it's important to have their input and their involvement in the schools. And I just want to end this slide with the fact that there are many, many best practices, and I hope they come up. I can't mention them now as we move forward today. Last slide, I think. Right. I just want to mention these very special challenges and food for discussion as we move forward here, that too often what you see is that when working with refugee communities and also with migrant communities, that there's a real focus on trauma, on a deficit, instead of working on the fact that many of these young people have much to bring to the table. They're very resilient, and really focusing on the positive nature rather than the negative nature of what they bring to the table. I'm going to leave the next point of the COVID crisis to Gelly, because Gelly's also going to talk about that. I saw that in her slide. And then the final point, and maybe we can talk about that, there are many best practices throughout the years. The last decades have seen tons of these best practices being developed across Europe and across the globe, but so few people, so few teachers, so few policymakers are aware of these practices that really work. And how do we best disseminate these practices as we move forward? I'm going to leave it at that, Laura. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Barry. Thanks for getting us started and raising some of the real challenges that are faced both by teachers and around the whole school system in tackling these challenges. So next, we'll hear from Dr. Jelly Aroni. And just to mention, please keep your questions coming in the chat. We'll have time for Q&A after all the presenters have spoken. So, Dr. Jelly, what opportunities and challenges in building positive relations among children of migrant, refugee, and host communities are there from your experience? And what are the needs that you've identified in terms of learning and well-being? And could you also talk about how ethics education can be used to address those needs? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I always feel so welcomed in the Arigato context, and I'm particularly grateful for being after Barry, because he set the context very, very well. So I will just take it from there and continue with the challenges. I agree with Barry. I do not like the word problems. There are challenges, and we have the dominant school practice still based upon the values, norms, and experiences of the native population. And how cannot teachers have these subtle biases that Barry mentioned when we have the whole curricula of countries that value the majority culture? The same goes with the assessment tests, which in the majority of the cases are completely inappropriate for migrant and refugee populations. In many cases, in many countries, and definitely this is true for Greece, we have the clustering of migrant and refugee students in underperforming schools with all the dimensions, the perspectives, and the challenges that this means. And one of the main challenges, I do agree with Barry, is that the technological innovation and all these digital tools that were put into the spotlight due to the COVID-19 crisis have unfortunately widened the inequalities instead of narrowing them. We all know that especially refugee students do not have the electronic devices. They do not have the appropriate internet connectivity to be able to work in long distance and in online education. And we did not have enough offline alternatives for them. Opportunities. I will take it from the world of a high school principal with refugee students in his school. And for me, it sums up what I would like to say and what the solution is. Refugee students brings to school wealth and challenge. If these students have been so competent to survive everything they had to, then we have a lot to learn from them. What we need an asset-based approach. We need to highlight and concentrate on what these students have, in contrast to this deficit-based thinking, which always emphasize what they lack. To be more specific, what do they bring? They bring a wide array of skills and strengths, both to the classrooms and to the communities. Many of them have navigated multiple countries and schools, and their persistence, perseverance, adaptation, grit, I would say, are striking. Some have demonstrated tremendous resilience. They have survived natural disasters, armed conflict, wars, and refugee camps. They have determination, courage, and problem-solving skills. Many of them speak 2, 3, and sometimes as many as 4 languages. We know now from research and from practice and from work at the field that they acculturate faster than their parents. So they assist their parents in translation, in mediation, and other cultural bridging. In school, they support classmates. They bridge the gap between the teachers and the most recent arrivals. Outside of class, they often work long hours to help support their families, or they act as essential caregivers to younger siblings, especially the girls. I think that one of the most valuable things that they bring with them is that they make us appreciate our own life and everything that we take for granted. As for my reply to what ethics education can contribute, I think that for me, ethics education is focused on being. So when an education is focusing on socio-emotional learning and considers students are beings rather than human doings, then they can help promote the learner's well-being. Especially for refugee students, they can mitigate the impact of conflict and disaster. Why? Because they provide a safe and stable learning environment. They restore normalcy. They give these children back their childhood. They restore dignity. They offer hope by giving them a structured and appropriate supportive activity. A last note about Greece. Greece is 90% composed of Christian Orthodox. So learning to live together contribute to the interfaith dimension of ethics education. This is what Barry said, that religion and faith is usually absent from intercultural education. So ethics education can give this especially to Greece, that is considered a monoethnic, a monocultural, and a mono-religious country. And knowing, fully being aware that this is not an easy task, I finish with the words of a Nobel-winning poet who said that when you cannot find spring, you make it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. I really appreciate you talking about this asset-based approach. It's very rare, actually, that we hear people talking from that perspective, and I feel like we should be doing that more in our sector. So thank you. We'll now turn to Panayotis Foukas, who is working directly with children. So Panayotis, can you tell us how we can support a culture of learning to live together through interfaith and intercultural learning from your experience? Over to you.
Hello, Laura, thanks. I thank everyone for giving me the chance to speak and discuss with all of you these matters. So my idea, which I try to implement in public schools in Greece, more specifically in Chania, Crete, is that we should return education to its humanocentric roots. What does that actually mean? We should be teaching philosophy, specifically ethics, and religion. Philosophy can be more easily understood. Why? Because it provides the tools, reason and self-control. But why combine it with religion when, as was previously said, religion in Greece is 98–80% Christian Orthodox? Because all religions, even though they significantly differ, ask the same pivotal questions. Where does this world come from? Why are we born? And why should we die? What defines our destiny? If we aim at an intercultural education of peace, then religion and its diversity should be taught alongside ethics by placing emphasis on religion's common ground, their struggles for peace, freedom, and justice. For the protection of human dignity, for accepting and promoting human rights culture. I tend to believe that the human rights culture should judge religion and not the other way around as it's normally perceived. Anyway, in order to combine philosophy and religion to create an environment of dialogue and cooperation by discussing existential questions, we need teachers with heart, faith, love, and hope, with openness, ecumenical spirit, and dynamism, with broad cultural interests, such as theater, music, dance, literature, etc. All these are our weapons to teach ethics in school. Students do not ever need to hear words such as philosophy or ethics, but the teacher should be capable of directing a Socratic dialogue in order to promote critical thinking, a spirit of openness, and not just tolerance. This creative approach can give students the opportunity to get to know and understand each other, witness the other as a fellow human being. We cannot communicate with the other when we do not understand religious diversity. As of October 2020, I teach the course of religion in 3 public schools in Chania to 14 and 15-year-olds, where I try to implement the aforementioned ideas. I shall now present the following 2 examples. I should note here that when dealing with younger students, of course, one should implement other techniques, most notably theater-inspired ones. So let's give 2 examples. Firstly, in class, I start by posing an ethical dilemma. I have here 2 examples on screen, you can see them. Or a question, should we eat meat? Or is it easier today to be a man or a woman, and why? I try to get as many varying answers as possible. Sometimes I organize them in groups, making sure that each group consists of various national or religious backgrounds. That is very important. I then provoke them into discussion with each other by presenting them with some perspective, philosophical or religious, upon their opinions, and I encourage them to give birth themselves to a moral answer. After we reach a moral answer together, or sometimes several answers, I present them with a philosophical or religious source, a text, or I don't know, a tradition that tackles a similar issue or that expresses a similar moral answer. Imagine that you have probably a Muslim giving a moral answer, and we find that answer, that similar answer on, I don't know, a text of Plato or whatever. So that creates discussion and gets the interest of the students. Second example, sometimes I narrate a story, such as the Good Samaritan, the Great Inquisitor of Dostoevsky, and so on and so forth. Then I engage in conversation around one or more moral subjects. For example, why did Odysseus, Ulysses in Latin, abandon the nymph Calypso when she provided him with everything a man of our times desires? Immortality, eternal youth, great food and drinks, and so on and so forth. Depending on the student's approach and combining an actor's improvisation with a teacher preparation, you have to improvise all the time, to be like an actor, to grasp every reaction from the students and be there to fill the gap or give them something to go on. So I use these techniques to direct the conversation towards my goals. For example, to teach that one should care for more than one's appearance, that an educated mind is sexier than a well-worked out body, that Odysseus' true match was Penelope and not Calypso due to their unity of mind and feeling, etc., etc., depends on the subject. By applying these methods, I aim at making the students realize that they are all humans and that any other designation, such as their nationality or their religion, does not change that. On the contrary, diversity enriches this realization. How? If we focus on the humanocentric elements of their different traditions. Because, of course, each tradition, each religious tradition, has its own humanocentric elements that are common ground. So, introducing ethics in a religion course does not betray Christian faith or the course's aims. One of the Orthodox Church's main mission, if not the most important one, is to aid the other in need, which is the migrant and the refugee. We cannot forget that in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the injured in need is nowadays the migrant and the refugee, who awaits a Good Samaritan in all of us. The Church of Greece, for instance, through its NGO Syniparxis, has organized several shelters in Greece for unaccompanied minors, provide them not only with the essentials, but also offering education and psychosocial support in order to give those suffering others the chance of a normal future life as a European citizen. That's what's important. Also, His All Holiness the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, sorry, I forgot to turn the slide, head of one of the founding churches of the World Council of Churches, has made inter-Christian and inter-religious dialogue his life's goal by organizing several forums, symposia, meetings, and even marches, standing side by side to those in need and those under discrimination. I quote, "War in the name of religion is a war against religion. His words and acts should inspire us. If we want a society of love and justice, we need to realize that we ought to change ourselves first. As a famous theologian once wrote, if we want to be good Christians, we need to spread the love we receive from God to our fellow humans. We should not forget that the only way to actually meet God is through the face of a fellow human, to act as a vessel of love. This is what solidarity means. It is not an easy choice, as it requires personal struggles and sacrifice, but it's a road worth taking, as it's full of love, the only way to overcome intolerance and fanatism." Let me finish my short presentation by quoting the recently deceased German theologian Hans Küng. "Religious communities ought to have as their primary educational duty the pacifying elements of their faith and their will to discuss with those of different faith. This stance should be promoted in the legislation for education, in school books, in teaching, in adult training, and in teachers' training." Thank you.
Thank you, Panagiotis, and thanks for painting a picture of what goes on in your classroom. It sounds really fantastic. It makes me want to go back to school again and be a student. Wonderful, and thanks for giving us that eye into the classroom. So finally, we're going to hear from Maria Alicia Uribe. Maria Alicia, what are the key elements of ethics education for children that can foster solidarity and learning to live together? And how can this contribute to fostering positive relations between communities and enhance the education and well-being of children?
Thank you. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, everyone. And it's always difficult to be the last one of the panelists after these great interventions. But I want to respond to that important question, Laura, looking at three things: the what, the how, and the why. And Panagiotis described, and Geli also talk about ethics and ethics education. And so let me start by saying that when we talk about ethics, it's about relationships. So we are talking about an ethics of care, and it's about how we relate to one another, how we live these relations with the other. And so ethics education is actually an approach in terms of content, but also in terms of form, in how we deliver education, but also in what is inside this delivery of the education. So ethics education supports learners to develop ethical reflections and ethical awareness. So it's not so much in terms of doing right and wrong and this kind of dichotomy, but it's really understanding the consequences of their actions on others, on themselves, on nature, on what it means for the other, what it means in terms of building relations with one another, in terms of making the world a better place, and their contribution to that. So ethics education helps learners to develop individual and collective responsibilities, understanding what is the role they have in the society, enables them to empathize with one another and develop respect for relations with others. And I think that's very important, and very often this part in education is left, as Geli was saying, this more socio-emotional aspect of education, learning to empathize with this other, who is different, who is diverse, who is not the same as us. And ethics education also empowers the learner to learn to make ethical decisions in the spirit of freedom, to let children and young people choose, and also equip them to reconcile differences with others and solve the conflicts towards a common good. So this is what we mean by ethics education, but there is a spiritual dimension, I would say, to this ethics education, which I believe is very important. Ubuntu is a term in Zulu language that means I am because you are. And I think that changes the understanding of ethics education. It's not just about, understanding an issue and trying to resolve it, a conflict, but it's this understanding that we hold the life of the other in our hands, and that who we are depends on the other, and that we are shaped by those relations with the other. So that is, in a way, very spiritual. It's the sense of interconnectedness. In Arigato International, we have what we call our ethics education framework and approach, where we have the child at the center of the experience. And for this ethics education to take place, we look at the learning environments. That learning environment needs to be context sensitive, minority, majority dynamics, who are the children attending, what are the needs of children, young people, their background, what Gaeli was saying, what they bring to the classroom. We need to create safe learning environments, calling children by their name, allowing them to have a safe space to learn, but also a safe space to be who they want to be, to express as well, to express their own religion, their culture, who they are. And we need to use participatory and collaborative learning. Ethics education cannot happen through lecture. We need to create the spaces for children to play, to enjoy through case studies, as Panagiotis was sharing. So it's participatory, it's collaborative. We learn with the other when we do ethics education. We don't learn about the other. And there are certain transformations that we see happening when we talk about ethics education. Critical thinking is a very important element. And that's a very important aspect, that children learn to think on the consequences of their actions, but also the information they receive and what it means for them and for the other. The other aspect is critical consciousness, which is different to critical thinking. And this is more from Paulo Freire approach, in where the children realize their privileges or lack of, what's the role in their society, how they can transform that. It's self-driven learning, so it's not imposed. You cannot impose a child to be respectful with others, to empathize with others. It's self-driven, it needs to be internalized. And it needs to provide the spaces to imagine possibilities. What if the world were different? What if we were to be able to live together and understand one another in better ways? It has to lead to collective action, so that the end children and people can work together. And it requires, as they were saying in the beginning, Barry and Gaeli talking about the importance of teacher training, role modeling. And that's a very important aspect, that we as educators are role models, but we also model vulnerabilities. And I think that's very important. We don't have all the answers. We build knowledge together with the children. We go away from the vertical way of education to a horizontal relation, where children and people, educators, build knowledge together. And last is it's the sense of interconnectedness. At the end of the day, that's what we are trying to create, this sense of interconnectedness with one another. So to finalize, and I can maybe expand a little bit later, I want to finish with a story. It's a very short story, and some of you might have heard about this. It's the story of a woman and a boy. So once there was a wise old woman and a smart little boy. The boy was driven by a single desire to expose the wise old woman as a fool. The smart boy had a plan. He had captured a small and very fragile bird in the forest. With the bird cupped in his hands, the boy's scheme was to approach the old woman and ask her, "Old woman, what do I have in my hands?" To which the wise old woman would reply, "You have a bird, my son." When the boy would ask, "Old woman, is the bird alive or is it dead?" If the old woman replied that the bird was dead, the smart boy would open his hands and allow the bird to fly off back into the forest. But if the old woman replied that the bird was alive, the smart boy would crush the bird inside his capped hands and crush it until at last the bird dies. Then the boy would open his hands and say, "See, old woman, the bird is dead." And so as the story goes, the smart boy went to the old woman and he said, as planned, "Old woman, what do I have in my hands?" The old woman replied, "You have a bird, my son." "Old woman," the boy then said, his voice was dripping with disdain, "is the bird alive or is it dead?" Whereupon the old woman looked at the boy with her kind old eyes and replied, "The answer is in your hands, my son." And that, for me, is the why of ethics education. The Danish theologian Løgstrup introduces this concept of ethical demand. We are demanded to respond to others and to the situations that affect others, not because of sympathy, but because of the simple fact that our lives depend on each other and we are interconnected. We hold the life of others in our hands. Our actions affect us all, and what we do or not do have an impact around others. And this is this ethics of care and this ethics education that we want to transmit. And I believe this is a prerequisite to learning to live together with others in solidarity. So I let it here for maybe more discussions and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria Lucia. And that's a really helpful framework, the what, the how, and the why, for kicking off this discussion. And thanks to all the presenters for your interesting, insightful, and thought-provoking presentations, and for keeping to time, because that actually gives us some time for discussion. I've seen the chat lighting up with discussion already, so I think we are prepped to have a really good discussion. And Rita has been helping me to gather some of the questions in the background. So maybe we can talk a little bit about teachers. This came up in a number of the presentations, obviously them being absolutely critical for any of this to happen, but also the challenges around that. There was a comment on in relation to Barry's presentation saying, schools and learning institutions are kind of the next stop for families, as soon as they arrive in a new place. And so teachers and education managers need to be well prepared to handle the diversity and enable kids to have the life skills that they need. A question that was posed was how to improve the teacher recruitment process, and I would add training, which you touched on, Barry, to ensure that we have teachers that have the qualities that they need to work with diverse classrooms. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more, Barry, about that.
Yes, thank you. In terms of the role of the teacher, I think it's been mentioned in the chat that one of the key issues, if we're talking about ethical issues or moral issues, if we're talking about human rights, if we're talking about the students' culture, religion, anything that might be seen as a vulnerability, anything that they might feel hesitant to talk about for various reasons. What it means is that, and this was also mentioned in the chat, it's important that a safe space is created in a classroom where students feel comfortable to talk about these kinds of issues. Too often they don't feel comfortable. And one of the reasons they don't feel comfortable is that some of them, when they do try, hear comments that are not necessarily positive or that make them feel uneasy. Now, this is a totally different kind of teacher that's needed in a context like that, to talk, for instance, about a student with a different religion who, during his or her daily life, hears negative comments in the media and from society about one's religion, and then to ask that student to open up a little bit in the class about that issue is a risk. So it means that a certain amount of training needs to take place in the pre-service stage already, and also in the in-service stage. How does one create a school where human rights are dominant, and also where students' human rights are respected, where their voices are respected, and where they feel safe? I'll give you one example. I'm going to be very brief of my experience with the issues of bullying. That I'm now thinking of a specific context, which was Lithuania. And I had done a workshop with the teachers initially about bullying in the school, bullying around issues of belief, around religion, around cultural background. And I asked the teachers to what extent that was taking place in the school. Now, only a couple teachers said that they were aware of this kind of bullying taking place. I did the same workshop parallel to that with the students. And I asked the students, can you think of examples where bullying took place around this kind of issue? They all had examples. They came up with a list, like, I can't remember, 30, 40 examples that they knew of. And I asked them, how many of you actually have talked about this with the teachers? And they said almost never. A few said, well, we had done it, but what the teachers did, they made it worse by singling out people, by not having the ability to discuss this in a respectful way in the classroom. So they said after a couple of negative experiences, they decided among the student body, when they were aware of these kinds of experiences, never to talk to the teachers about it again. So of course it then festers. But what it shows is that oftentimes this kind of bullying does take place, but there's a lack of awareness among the teachers. So being trained around this, but also how does a teacher become aware that this kind of bullying does take place? What are the symptoms? What are the signs that this kind of bullying is happening? So that's just one aspect that I'll touch upon. The others might have other things they'd like to add to that.
Yeah, Jelly, I see your hand raised.
Yes, I wanted to add to what Barry said, because I have been working in intercultural education since 1998. And I have seen lots of teachers, and especially the last 5 years that I worked at the Ministry of Education before I moved to Ministry of Migration. For me, it's not only a matter of competence, it's a matter of emotional availability and care. Because I have seen a lot of teachers that are not trained. They do not have masters or PhDs in intercultural education and human rights and ethics, but they care. And when they care, they can see if a child is miserable. You do not have to be trained to see that a child does not smile, to see that a child is afraid of getting outside the classroom to be in the break. So for me, before training, it's the basics. And then somebody who is willing. I have seen very young teachers teaching refugees with no experience, no training, and they are the best because they are willing to be, because they are there for them. And I have seen teachers with masters that they just don't want to deploy their knowledge and skills to refugees, although they are trained. So it's also a matter of the basic emotional personality and availability of the teacher. I always believe that a real teacher who is not very good with refugees, I cannot believe that he or she is good with the Greek students or any other native students. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, so there's some kind of general competencies of the teachers, even themselves, around social and emotional learning and being able to sort of understand the students. And the questions around kind of do teacher training courses actually trained for that, or are they simply teaching on learning on subject instruction?
Can I respond for 2 minutes to that? Just
yes,
to add.
Sure.
I think both are needed. I think that Paul Gorski, who's one of the key scholars in terms of intercultural education and social justice education, has always mentioned that good intentions are not enough. I think that Gelly is correct in saying that a caring pedagogy is extremely important. Sonia Nieto, I'll put that in the chat, has done a lot of work to develop that. There's also a cultural issue there. It points to the fact that teachers view the profession very differently, and that is also something that you see across the board in different societies. So the research that's been done, and for instance, the way teachers view their own role in Northern and Western Europe, for the most part, they see it as a profession. And they feel that this is something that they do from 9 to 5. There are many other parts of the world, and then I'm looking more towards Asia. And I'm glad you mentioned Ubuntu earlier, Maria, that teachers don't see their job purely as a profession. They choose their job because they feel they have a mission. And their mission is to care for kids. And this is not something that happens between 9 and 4 o'clock, but this is part of their philosophy of life. It is part of their identity. And so that's important to look at, how teachers self-select who becomes a teacher and how do they see their role in the classroom. And that's something that's not often enough discussed.
Thank you, Barry, for adding those points. Really important. And yeah, do share that suggestion in the chat for further reading. So we talked about the teachers. I've also seen a number of questions and comments about the children, the students themselves. And one question came from Susan. What do children feel they need or have to contribute to ethics education? Are they involved in decision-making, policies and curriculum? What role do they feel ethics education plays in their lives? And does anyone have any documentation on this? Maybe I'll pass that question to Panayotis to tell us about how your students respond to your classes.
Well, it's difficult, and at first you have to provoke them to bring questions and examples that actually they don't like, but they feel they should speak about. I mean, a simple question: is it better to be a man or a woman today? That causes a strife inside the class, but this is something I want, because then some students that really don't care about the class want to be there and express themselves. So I think that's the first step. Of course, you have to be always ready. What? I didn't hear.
I think we're getting some interference. If you can
Exactly.
mute. Go ahead.
I was saying that this is a first step. Then you get to know your students, and you adapt. You see what they care about. You, of course, considering your goals, you can't talk about everything in one class. And what the children care about, mostly what they have in their day-to-day life. As was well said, bullying, gender relation, homophobia. I don't know if I'm using it right in English. These kind of things, or what they consider normal and their parents don't. So you ask things that are outside of ethics and religion, and based on their answer, I try to, put them aside a new way of thinking, or use their way of thinking to give them, something to think about. It doesn't always succeed, but it's a day-to-day process. You have to try and try again and fail and try again. It's something, I don't know if I cover if you want something else from me. I think that's my perspective.
Yeah, Maria Lucia.
Yes, I'd like to contribute. I like these examples that Panayotis give. I think from our experience, and I like this question from Sonia, because from our experience, we see that when children go to these kind of programs where you create those safe spaces, where they are the actors in a way, you see that they are empowered. At the end, you see how they open up. There were children that maybe were not able to express themselves, and you see at the end they are willing to express themselves, that they are not afraid of saying I agree or disagree with this, because a safe space has been created. You see a sense of purpose, but you see also a sense of meaning also, and able to share without being afraid of expressing who they are, because they are from a different religion or a different culture, ethnic group. And we have seen this across the board in many locations. Back in 2015, we did a monitoring and evaluation process of our program. And we did it in Greece, in Kenya, in Romania, in El Salvador, and in India. And across the board, we could see how children who belong to minority groups, they felt that they had a power to say who they were, that they felt that they could make friends, that they could see that that they made a difference also in the lives of others. Our programs help children to come together to develop projects together, to develop initiatives. And we saw that the children that were never really active in the classroom or withdrawn, they were trying to develop projects together with others. We saw for example, in Kenya, where different ethnic groups, where children said, I didn't know, or I was afraid of this other person from another religion. And now I think that what my parents think about them is not right. And we saw this change of thinking. We also saw, and I think Geli, that came from Greece in the program you implemented, a decrease in violence during the breaks in schools, because children were always fighting to each other and they didn't agree with each other. And there was a decrease that we see, which of course we couldn't perhaps see that it was a direct, result of this, but throughout a period of time, we could see that. So I think there are many results that sometimes are intangible when it comes to ethics education, but they are very much, we can see there is a combination of the teacher, as Geli was mentioning, but also a culture of learning to live together in a way that is created. And we saw this across the board, that in places where the teacher was good, but there was an institutional support and a culture that was created, the results were seen in a higher level.
Thanks, Maria Lucia. I see Jelly, you had your hand up, and then Panagiotis.
I wanted to add to what Maria Lucia said and to what Angelos and Barry were discussing in the chat, that we need to include ethics education in all pillars of a school life. So school ethos and school governance is among them. So it's not only a matter of the teacher and what takes place in a classroom, but it is also how the school governance is managed and what are the policies and what are the rules, and also the extroversion of the school to the community and what the ethos is there. And in the case of my school, that we can share also with Susan, at least you can also have the monitor and evaluation of my project. We had the whole school ethos working. It was not just me doing the project with my students and then the students were off to another mentality. We need a whole school approach for that.
Yeah, fully agree, Jelly. Panagiotis, and then we'll go to Barry.
I totally agree with Dr. Aroni, because with sometimes I feel like a Don Quixote trying some things and then, other teachers have different ideas. But I wanted to go back to Maria Lucia, that she said, what I try to do is I understand the classroom as a theater with no spectators. So I always try to say to the students that they are the actors and they need to improvise and say what they think, not what I think. It doesn't matter what I think, what I've studied. They keep asking, what do you think, sir? But say, no, please say, what do you think? And at the end, I'll give you my input. But firstly, you. And this is very difficult, but little by little, day by day, they get accustomed to it and they like it. And they say, what are we going to discuss today? And another thing that Maria Lucia said that is very troubling is that I tend to hear, but my parents or my teachers, my other teachers say different things than you, sir, or different things that what we've discussed here. And I always try to say, what do you think? That's what matters. It doesn't matter what is given to you, but how you work with what is given to you.
Thank you, Panagiotis. Barry, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I don't see it I don't see it digitally. Somehow that's not showing up on my screen. I want to emphasize what Geli said about the whole school approach, that in a document I created for the European Commission, we looked at what kinds of approaches really are effective in terms of combating intolerance. And again, and this is also something the European Commission and the EU are pushing, is what is needed is a whole school approach. However, in most cases at least across Europe, you don't see these whole school approaches. I wanted to get back 1 second very briefly to the example of creating a culture of acceptance in the school and how this whole school approach can work and how to give students an active role in all this. One of the most inspiring things I've ever seen was in Lisbon in Portugal, where when there were any kinds of conflicts in the school, that there was a small student group that was responsible for having office hours in the school. So the students did not have to go to the teachers right away. They didn't always feel comfortable with that and had a hard time communicating with the teachers, and they didn't know if there were repercussions. And this group of about 4 or 5 students had created a kind of committee in the school. They had their own space that the students could go to if they had some kind of an issue with, for instance, bullying, and they could report it to the students first. And the interesting thing there also is when they created this, this committee of the students, they selected some of the students that they felt were vulnerable and students that were troublemakers in the school. And they said, listen, we're going to teach you martial arts, but we're also going to teach you some psychology here of how to deal with conflicts in the school. They weren't so interested for the most part in how to resolve conflicts, but they were definitely interested in the martial arts. But that was part of the entire package. It had a huge impact on the school culture and the extent to which students felt comfortable going to initially the student committee and talking to them first about any kinds of issues they had. One thing you see in many schools around the world is student councils. However, part of the problem with student councils is they usually have no voice. They are there only in name. Where they do a fairly decent job with student councils is in Scandinavian countries where they really do have some power in the decision making. And I think it was Susan in the chat who was talking about this. So it's important that student councils are not there in name only. In terms of other things I've seen, and I mentioned this in my presentation, I could talk about some best practices. In Norway, they've done this now for decades. Every year in the entire country, and the Norwegians tend to be fairly modest people, I think, so they don't, at least the ministry doesn't talk about this ever. Every year they go to every single student starting at the age of 5 or 6, and they ask them questions about whether they feel accepted by their teachers, by their peers, and they have them fill out this questionnaire from the age of 6 onwards in Norway. And then in this way, they get the students involved in talking about the kinds of issues that they think are important to them, how they're being treated, and about the culture in the school. I have an example, if anybody wants that, I have it on my computer. I think it's fantastic. One other thing, just very briefly in 1 minute, I think that in terms of the connection to the community, because that's come up kind of between the lines, service learning. If anybody's interested in talking about service learning and the way that works, I think it's a very effective mechanism to create that connection to the community and have that discussion with the community, which is so often missing. And then one last thing, sorry, which might create some, I'm going to say conflict, but difference of opinion, is the necessity or the desirability of so-called zero tolerance approaches. So if anybody in the classroom makes a negative comment, says something that's homophobic, says something that is insensitive, or bullies somebody in terms of what they're saying, do you or do you not take a zero tolerance approach? I'm not going to answer that right now, but I'm going to say it's very, very controversial and it's oftentimes used. Sorry for taking up time.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Barry. So we've had a bit of time for Q&A, and hopefully I've captured some of the questions that are coming through the chat, but certainly not all of them. And I think it's time to move to breakouts, because we really want you all to be able to have the opportunity to talk with one another and to discuss more of these challenging issues together. So I'm going to pass over to Suchis, who's going to give us the instructions for the breakout. So, but just to say thanks to the panelists for getting this conversation started and for your really valuable
Thank you for moderating
contributions. My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you for all the wonderful reflections so far. It's been really interesting to listen to. So I hope the breakout rooms will offer a more intimate space to really go more detailed into different perspectives of what we've been discussing. We are going to have 3 different breakout rooms, and each one will have a different focus, looking at the perspectives from the issues around the teachers, and then the children, and also the engagement to the community that has been emerging from the conversation so far. So let me quickly share the questions we had. These are the questions. You will see them on the chat, and the 3 different groups that you will find yourselves in. You will have a question to respond to, and one of you from the group is invited to come back and report. There'll be a facilitator to help you in this task. When I create the breakout rooms, you will get a pop-up asking you to accept to join one of those groups. So please do click on that and join the breakout rooms. When it's almost time to finish, we will send you a small notification and bring you back to the plenary. But it's important that you click this button that pops up saying join breakout room so that you are taken to the respective room that you've assigned to. It's a random assigning, so you'll find yourselves in one of the three during the breakout room session. So let me quickly do that. Please do actively share once you are there and have a conversation with the others who are there in the group.
And that means that we have to be motivated in order to do that. We must be really positive, reflective, and transmit safety vibes to the children, to our students, and support them and help them with the transition to their hosting country. And we have to be really sensitive in order to hear, in order to really feel their needs. We think that this is very important. The facilitator needs to be open-minded and of course very willing to learn from children, and teachers should know that cultural diversity and action are very, very important in order to accept differences among students. And we need to be aware. We need to be aware of all these issues. So I'm giving the baton to somebody else from my group. They promised that they are going to help.
Oh God. Is anybody else going to?
Let's be fair. Let's be fair.
Okay, we'll be fair. One important thing that we said is that becoming aware of having stereotypes is quite difficult situation, because sometimes the stereotypes are very subtle, and the more subtle they are, the impact they have to students is that they're making an internal attribution to them, feeling that there is something wrong with them. So it's very important for a teacher of being aware that he's a role model of fighting his stereotypes, and remembering that he has to do with children. That is a very important thing. So how come somebody who is a product of a certain education, especially from countries like Greece, which are countries that are not used to multicultural education, how can somebody fulfill this role and all these specific characteristics? Some of ideas that we've discussed, we're having basic knowledge of what multiculturalism is, having the understanding, being aware that a teacher is also eternally a student and lifelong learning is required, that critical pedagogy is also a tool, and what kind of tools we need to empower the children. Never forget that we're creating citizens, and realizing that education is a political thing, but not a political in the terms of parties, political parties, but as we're creating citizens, we cannot avoid being political ourselves. And of course that it's very important that there is a whole school approach. All teachers need to have competencies to work in multicultural environments, not just those working with refugees on a specific subjects. And of course, in a very wider context, it's very important what the political rhetorics are in each country, which also affects how schools work and what are the perceptions of teachers and local community be. And also it's very important, as Barry said, to think that there's teaching about diversity and teaching through diversity, which means that apart from theoretical stuff, we have to take action on some matters. I hope I wrapped it up. Have I forgotten something? Feel free to pop in if you want to. I kind of read what we wrote, the notes.
I think that covers it.
Okay, so that's all from group number 1.
All right. Shall we hear from group number 2? Did someone want to volunteer to present?
Yes. I will, on the behalf of second group, try to best of my knowledge, summarize the key points of our discussion. I would kindly ask the other members of the group to help, as they are experts in education, but maybe it's not bad to give this task to somebody who is, let's say, more into the job of integration in migrants and a bit less in education itself. So we had a question that initially looked very easy to answer because we had such a good input from the panelists and from Panayotis. And the question was, how can educators adapt pedagogical practices that can help create safe learning environment? And we started from the profile of the teacher. And we said that what is extremely important is basically to have a profile of a teacher that has, as Geli mentioned, this type of emotional intelligence, that type of competencies, and as well a bit of a courage to apply that knowledge and to have a courage to be provocative in order to really move students into discussions and, let's say, accepting or challenging certain values in order to confirm them. Then we were talking a lot about creating dialogue, creating the safe environment on behalf of the teachers towards the class, so that the kids feel confident enough to share their thoughts. We were talking about many new techniques that can be used, from, let's say, theater, dialogue, provocative, let's say, questions, the games, and so on. And during the discussion, we heard actually many nice examples of that. Then we were talking about how to actually as well create some type of a safe environment for the teachers, so they can feel confident and at ease when teaching ethics and, let's say, posing certain questions. We've heard that there are laws, there are resolutions confirmed of the Council of Europe and so on, that are talking about, they are like the base, or we can use them, but only sometimes it's hard to practically enforce them in the reality, and that it really depends a lot on the teachers and the way of the educators and how they do it. Then we were talking about that ethics and religion are to be dealt within educational context as a part of equal learning opportunities. And maybe Vangelos can help me about, we were talking how actually ethics is going through every single subject that is going on in the school. It does not necessarily concerns, let's say, the topics regarding religious, but every single teacher is interested if ethics are observed or actually brought in into the, let's say, the learning process. So please be free to add something. I just said some of the most striking points that I found, let's say, more, for me, the most interesting ones.
Let me, well, thank you. I have nothing to add to that. Oh. Just to say that I was mixing the Jamboard, trying to put things as we followed them. So we started from very practical things, presenting to ourselves how good those pedagogical practices are and how possible they are to be done. So we're not talking about something theoretical, but we talk about something that can be done.
Yeah.
And then discussing about the need of the teachers, not only to know about them, but to have experienced them, as Barry presented, to have experienced them in advance as teacher students or as teachers in their training, and understand that those pedagogical practices are not just because of the refugee students, but for their own benefit, the teachers' benefit, that they can give some solutions or way out to the main problems that we, the teachers, face in our school today, like discipline, like students' interests, like students' concentration and work and things like that. And then, yes, ethics is not on the human right that says that everybody is free to have a religion free of consciousness and talking. But here we speak about the right to equal opportunities in education. So ethics is not something of a certain subject, but ethics is a way, and values is a way that the school is functioning, is working. And all of that is legal. All of that is described in the educational laws of all the countries. So nobody can say that it's, well, people can say it's crazy, but they cannot say it's not legal. So we can do it.
Exactly.
Wonderful, thanks, Daniela and Angela. So is there anything else from your group? Think all good, and yeah, in which case, all right, then let's move to group 3. I think that was my group, and I think Emika was
yes,
here at the end.
I am already assigned by our group leader to present this. Oh, can I see the questions too? Yeah. So the question for our group was, what are ways children from refugee, migrants, and host communities can work together on collective actions that can transform the relationships between their communities? So from our group discussion, we have group members from different countries. We have members from India, from Greece, from Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. I hope I don't miss any other country here. And so we discussed the first question. The ways that children can come together would be, one is like through activities, mainly through activities, and also to play. For example, cultural programs that participated by students, and in some countries, I think it was maybe India, or our colleague from India or Sri Lanka mentioned that it helped transform the relationship between the children. Sport competition, also religious congregation activities that children can from different religions can join together, and and then they can get to know each other. Also art activities, visiting to the museums, like group activities among children. And also I think one of the most important thing that we mentioned is about play, that if children play together, even they don't know the language, they not use the language, but they can connect and they can play, they can communicate through play. So if, for example, they play in the neighborhood, they also have a chance to mix and get to know other children. And in addition to that, there's also the mentioning here about the situation in Sri Lanka, the post-war context, where there are like 2 ethnic groups in which the children, both communities, they seem to be like open, and they want to, they're willing to be open and respect to others and learn different languages. And our members also mentioned that the students, they needs to be motivated, and this must be supported by teachers to bring them together and give them the space to be together and interact with each other. On the second question about how we can, or adult or teachers or communities can support the children. So there are several things here, but I think the support mainly should be coming from not only the schools, but also the family and also the wider families, including grandparents, for example, and the role of faith community is also important. And we say that ethics is embedded in all religions. So what else? I hope I don't miss anything here. Yeah, the ethical behavior also should start from home, and and it should be a holistic cycle of support from school, from communities, from parents. And one important thing is about informal education and non-formal education. These sector play a big role, a significant role in contributing to ethic education programs. Yeah, please add in if you have anything to add. And yeah.
Thanks,
you did a great job, Emiko. I have nothing to share.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, likewise. I agree. All right, so I think we have a little bit of time for a bit more discussion. If people wanted to add on to those thoughts or ask questions from the other groups or dig into some of those issues a bit more. So I think we have about kind of 10-15 minutes, and then I'll do a bit of a summary at the end, but I just want to open it up for people to comment, reflect. This is the moment to share your thoughts and any ideas popping up from the groups or experiences that you've had.
If I may, I have no, excuse me, wait a moment, sorry. Sorry, what would be interesting, as we've discussed in our group, because we all seem to agree very much on everything, would be if somebody has some different opinion. Barry mentioned that, is somebody who objects to what we've said, who has a different opinion on what we've said, because we seem to agree so much that it was quite alarming. I mean, you understand the point, for conversation's sake. Is somebody else who feels that something was missed or misinterpreted or anything? That would be interesting to hear on my part. That's my no, we all agree. It's great.
Well, I have a thought following Vespina's remark. Usually when people see webinars like that and trainings like that, they are all people that think alike. And we have done so many trainings, for example, with Angelos in Greece, and we experience the same. So if we talk about teacher training, that everybody thinks it's very important, how do we get to teachers that they actually disagree? How do we get to teachers that they don't want to change their ways? They do not want to become more interculturally competent. Do we make trainings mandatory? What do we do? Because what Despina says, we face it in every training, not just a webinar, in trainings.
It's exactly my thought. I mean, this kind of discussion should be addressed to people who are not so aware or interested as we are. How, so a next step for us to discuss maybe is how disseminating this and passing the message in a way of making more people at least getting involved, not understanding or getting involved. Even through contradictions, some things can arise. That's a very important and good point. I totally agree with you.
Maybe at the school level, I mean, bringing this conversation at the school level so that everyone, even those who disagree or do not even know that this webinar is being held, are given a chance to speak and, you know, present their ideas, and maybe they gain some from us, we gain some from them, but being something like a discussion and then a training inside schools.
Angelos, please go ahead. I see your hand up.
Panayotis is right. And training in school has a totally different dynamic. It's really rich. But the problem is where to find time in school project or in school program when the final bell rings, everybody goes home. And we are very busy people in our minds, more than in reality, but that's how it is. I think that we have to hide everything we do under totally different titles. For example, intercultural education is something that implies that there's refugee students involved, so they try to introduce it from the window than from the door, and I don't want it because it's difficult. But what about solving your main educational problems in 3 steps? And we do intercultural education. I have the experience of with colleagues that we have cooperated for many things. Every time that I name religion, I am banned because people are afraid. They don't know, usually they don't know how to cope with it. So religion comes in, but not from the door. It is how to deal with differences that your students have. I don't say that religion is one of them, but it comes through the case study. I think we have to be a little bit smart.
And sell the product, right?
I
Yes.
see a hand up, Suchin.
Yes, I was thinking about what Kelly said in terms of how do we get those who are not buying into this to buy in? And I think what will bring people in is the success or the impact that they can see. If we have children who are transforming their lives and the communities, the children will demand it. If we can create models of success, if we can have moments, events, or opportunities where children are doing things and are engaged and there's a transformation happening, that transformation will inspire other people to join in. It will raise the bar. I think that's one of the ways that we can, it's what do you call, centers of excellence sort of model or approach, where you create centers of excellence that exemplify what we are talking about. And unfortunately, if I'm to ask many of you, can we have an exemplary project led by young people that is transforming relations between the communities? Sometimes we don't really have those case studies to present. We talk about the approach among us, but we don't have a student-led practice to showcase as a good practice. If we can have more of those, at least if the positive, those who bought in, working with the students to create those successes, then that I think has the change effect that will inspire more groups to follow and be engaged in that process and can be transformative and engage those who are not. So that's one thing. And that brings me to the reflections from the third group. I felt that many in the activities that were discussed and shared there were activities for children. Let's create a sports event for children. Let's create something for children. Whereas maybe what I foresee is children running a project to tackle xenophobia in Europe. Children running a campaign to interview families in the community and sharing experiences, how the multiculturalism is working on, what are the challenges, what is the discourse that we need to have. So children being in the forefront, especially considering many of the challenges happen on social media, and children are the ones who are more present there. They are the generation that's more actively using Instagram, sharing stories. They are the storytelling generation, digital storytelling generation. So where do we see this role of young people in transforming our communities as active agents of change? These are some reflections I wanted to share.
Thanks, Uchit. I see Jelly with your hand up. Please go ahead. If people want to come on audio, just feel free. Yeah.
I wanted to add to what Angelos and Suchit said. I also have a challenge. I will not say a problem because I agree with Barry that I don't like the word problems with people's commitment. I think that something lacking is the commitment to do the work. For example, I take an example of today's webinar. Lots of people have registered, but they did not commit to follow up their registration and attend. Many teachers say they engage in projects, but when there are difficulties, they cannot commit, they drop out. And then we see the same in students, especially with refugee students, that they have faced a lot of adversities. They need encouragement and support in order to commit themselves in a learning process, in trusting people again. And the example they get from the adults is the inability to commit. We do not commit in personal relationships. We do not commit in professional relationships. So for me, it's becoming an issue, the commitment, professional commitment, if you like it.
I just want to add something to what Suchit was saying about organizing projects for the children. I also want to look at this from the perspective of organizing even children-led projects for the refugees, for the migrants. I think that perception needs to be changed when we do ethics education that transform relationships. Is about working with the other, not for the other. And I think that's important. We want to see more projects where children are actually working with the refugee, with the migrant, children from the local communities, doing things together and transforming the reality. I think it's that perception of inclusion that we need to move from this of doing for the other, doing it together. I think that's a critical thing. But one thing of Suchit was saying about this new narrative that children can create. We talk in our group about the fear of talking about religion in the classroom, or even bringing the religious identity of the child in the classroom. One, because teachers are not equipped, they are afraid of talking about this. These are difficult questions and they don't know how to deal with that. There is a lot of going on in our societies regarding religion and the fear of the other. But I think one way of approaching that, as Suchi was saying, is this new narrative that children can actually create when they engage with the other, when they do things with the other. That goes to the families. So without us directly inputting and telling the families, you know, this is important, or the parents, children are doing it. And it's this transformation that we would like to see happening. And of course, there is a challenge there, because many of us said, and Panagiotis was saying, parents are also coming to the teachers to say, why is my child learning about other religion? And so how do we deal with that as well? It's still an open question, no? It's the fear. But I think that whole school approach that we talk about, where the communities engage, I think that also has a snowball effect in the way we challenge those stereotypes and prejudices and fear of bringing religion and the religious identity into the classrooms.
Yeah, really important point. Thanks, Mary and Lucia, for adding that. Does anyone have any reactions to what people are saying? Does anyone disagree, as Despina was encouraging us to do? We don't all have to agree with each other, or anything we haven't touched on, anything we haven't thought about. One challenge I see, particularly in context of crisis, is just how much we're expecting teachers to do in so many different areas, and I think sometimes probably they feel overburdened and perhaps not motivated. Maybe they're not paid very well, maybe they're working overtime, and this is kind of additional, and as you say, that motivation is really key for them to engage with their students. That's something that we've been working on a little bit at INEE in terms of supporting teacher psychosocial support and well-being for them, because they're really at the forefront and dealing with those challenges. I wondered if anyone had any experience or reflections related to that point. Curious if anyone's work has looked at teacher well-being.
Well, now the pandemic has created a lot of support for teachers. I haven't participated myself, but I see all the emails coming. There is an effort towards the teachers and of course towards the children. Of course, the pandemic is the reason, but I think that a good practice should remain and after the pandemic goes.
Yes, Angela.
You asked for experience. Something that leads my work for years now is that many years ago, in a teacher training about cooperative learning, I had a math teacher. He told me from the first time that we met that he is there to prove that what I propose is nonsense and cannot be in math. And we agreed that he has 3 meetings and then we will discuss. On the second meeting, he told me that he wants to talk to me, and he demanded to talk face-to-face outside. So he was very angry. And when we were there, he said, I decided to experience one of those nonsense techniques in my class yesterday. And it was the first time that my students left the class smiling. And then he grabbed me from here and he said, can you tell me what I will do with the guilt that so many years I haven't done it? This is an experience. Speaking about the refugee and the migrant students, have we ever thought that every Asperger, hyperactive, homosexual, introvert, left-handed, fat, poor, rich student is a refugee in the school system? And have we thought that the same happens to the teachers who feel as refugees in the school system? So instead of trying to imply things, let's try to understand people and work with them their side for their benefit. And then we understand what ethics education is. Because I think this is the more ethical thing that we can do. So don't get mad to the people that don't. Just go by them and start together.
Thanks for sharing that example. And yeah, as you say, that gets to the heart of it, meeting people where they're at and listening to each other. Jelly, I see your hand up.
Yep, I wanted to add to what Angelo said, that it is true that teachers do not have the support they need. We always ask of them. They need to be competent. They need to be skillful. They need to transform from live education to online in one night. This is what happened in Greece, and I'm certain that it happened in many other countries. We had COVID, and then in one day, teachers that did not have computers, did not have digital tools, had nothing. They had to turn to online education for 4 hours. And then they had to do online with refugee students and online with migrant students. And they had their own kids at school that needed to use the computers at the same time. And then we tell them that they need training. And then we tell them that they need to be resilient and supportive. And I am among the ones that say that they need to be supportive and they need to be available. And I'm afraid that we're not doing enough for supporting the teachers. And in one of the seminars that we are doing with Angelos, we were discussing about incentives and internal incentives and motivation. And one teacher asked, well, we need to find internal motivation ourselves first, because they are underpaid, they are not given the tools to do their work properly, and we just ask things of them. So supporting
not socially respected, sorry.
Exactly. So maybe before training, there should be supporting the teachers, mentoring the teachers, and then some training.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Jelly. And I see nodding heads. I'll just see if there are any final comments before I do a bit of a wrap up. Does anyone have any final thoughts to share?
Maybe I jump in with the reflection that cuts across maybe the 3 webinars we ran as part of Solidarity. In the first webinar, we looked at the broader role of education, and we were like trying to reflect on what is this role. And I think very much like today, we were discussing this broader role, and especially the importance of going beyond integration to a inclusion approach to education in terms of the migrant and refugee communities. So how do we make it more reciprocal? How do we make it more inclusion rather than expecting integration just one way? And then in the second webinar, we focused a bit more on the psychosocial support. What does that mean, especially when we have refugee and communities that have gone through traumatic experiences when they come in? How do we provide that psychosocial support to create the conducive learning environments for children to be actually part of the education, feel safe, and there's many of the needs that Gelly talked about, that there are basic needs that need to be met to be able to really engage and be empowered through learning. And at the same time, we talked in the second webinar also about how psychosocial support can be also seen as something for the host community, because our tendency is to see psychosocial support is only needed for the refugees community. But maybe the host community is driven by fear, by xenophobia. So this is also psychological. So how do we support that as well in seeing psychological support in a more holistic sense, and again, a reciprocal sense than a one-way service to refugees and refugee children. And then today we talked a bit more around how does pedagogy come in, what is the role of the teacher, and what is the role of ethics in this, and creating an empowered learner who's really defining what is ethical, who's kind of leading the transformation in the community. So this is how I see the sort of how our dialogue has built across the 3 webinars, and I wanted to add that from my own reflections as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Suchit. It's really interesting to hear the connections, and it leaves us in a great spot for concluding. I will do my best to summarize just a little bit of what we've talked about today, and then I'll pass over to Maria Lucia for some final words. So we heard 4 presentations, each from different perspectives and different lenses on the challenges and opportunities of education in intercultural contexts. We heard first from Barry about the role of teachers as critical components of the education system, the need for well-trained teachers who are equipped to deal with the unique challenges of schools with students from different backgrounds, and also teachers who create safe spaces for children to learn. We heard from Jelly on an asset-based approach, looking at the child from a perspective of what they can bring and the skills that they already have to contribute to a positive learning environment. We heard from Panayotis a first-hand example of ethics education, how to adapt a curriculum to an intercultural context and in a way that encourages students to actively participate in their learning. And then we heard from Maria Lucia about the importance of centering children right at the center and engaging them in their education and designing programs that are relevant to their needs. And of course, also ensuring that those reflect the needs of all students. And then we had some lively breakout discussions and we talked about a variety of challenges and issues, which I won't try to summarize them all, but briefly, group 1, Joanna and Espina helped summarize that group's focused discussion on the educator, on the teacher, and what sort of educator is needed for this type of work. You've talked about the fact that teachers need to be motivated to deal with these challenging and diverse classroom environments, that teachers need to support children to transition into their host country, and that requires a teacher or a facilitator that's open-minded and willing to learn from children as well, and be aware of their own biases and their own held stereotypes, and also be aware that they're a role model and that they're setting an example for the other students in the classroom. You also mentioned that a teacher needs to be eternally a student, and I just saw that in the chat again, that teachers need to be also lifelong learners and constantly learning and adapting to their environments. And then we heard group 2, Daniela and Angelos, talked about the pedagogical practices that create safe and transformative learning environments. And you discussed that you started with the profile of teachers, and especially talked about emotional intelligence as a key part of that profile. And I like the way you described the courage to apply their skills and knowledge and to be provocative to move students to engage in challenging discussions. You talked about the importance again of creating safe spaces for students to share their thoughts, perspectives, and ideas, and feel that they are in a safe environment to be able to do that. And you also talked about pedagogical practices that ensure students' participation through games and other interactive activities. And then I think the final point that you mentioned was on this really important issue of the whole school approach. That it's not just limited to ethics education classes or philosophy or religion classes, but it needs to be integrated across the whole curriculum and in all subjects and all parts of the school to foster positive learning environments and intercultural learning environments. And then finally, group 3 focused on children themselves, again, putting the child at the center of the dialogue. And we heard examples from India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, and different ways of tackling diverse learning environments. We talked particularly about the importance of play, of cultural programs, sports activities, theater, and the arts as opportunities for students to collaborate and learn how to interact with each other in positive ways and learn from each other, learn about each other's cultures. We mentioned that children play together, even if they don't speak the same language, they find a way to communicate through play. And so fostering that interactive environment is really important for multicultural learning. And then finally, a point on the role of families and working with parents and caregivers to support open learning environments, working with PTAs and parent councils and other such ways of engaging the family. So I will stop there because I know we're at time, and I'll just pass over to Maria Lucia for some final words.
Thank you so much, Laura, for moderating and for guiding us and helping us in the discussions. I think they were great discussions. And thank you to my colleagues, Despina and Daniela, as partners in this project, and Kaisit Network for Dialogue, also who supported this process. Maybe just to say a couple of things before I give it to Despina for the final words in terms of the follow-up. So there are three things that we would like to share with you. One is that we would like to hear from you regarding case studies, good practices that you think would be important to consider. We are developing a booklet that in a way will be maybe not a summary, but really lifting up these important discussions that we have had during these last three webinars with the recommendations that you have given. So you will see that on our website of this project, Suchi.red, if you can put the website on the chat, you will see the summaries of all the webinars with the presentations of the speakers, materials that the speakers have shared, and then also forum discussions that you can also join. So, and then there will be a summary of this webinar, and you can find the summary of the previous webinars. So this booklet that we'll be working on is not a summary of the three, but really lifting up these important discussions that we have had, the recommendations that we have shared here. And we would also like to collect maybe some good practices and case studies. And you have mentioned a few. So if you can share them with us, contributing towards that through these forum discussions, that would be great. So that's the first one. The second one is that we are launching an online course, which is the course is called Ethics Education for Children, a Transformative Pedagogy for Learning to Live Together, which has been customized using the ethics education kind of framework to the current COVID-19 situation. And I would like to invite you also to join. The course is running from the 15th to the 28th of June, and the deadline for applying is 7th of June. And you can see the link also of the course here. And the third part is that once the booklet is developed, we would also like to hear your feedback on the recommendations that the booklet will have. We'll have recommendations for teachers, for educators in general, educators formal and non-formal education, for the schools, but also for policymakers. And we'd like really to get your feedback on all these recommendations so that we can enrich this booklet. So these are three ways to maybe continue the discussions and following up. We would love to continue in dialogue with you. I think these moments when we had the breakout groups were the best of all these webinars, because we could hear your voices and we could learn also from your experiences. So thank you so much for that enthusiasm, for spending these 2.5 hours with us. And I now turn it over to my colleague Despina and for the final word. So again, a vote of thanks to all of you, speakers, participants, Laura, our moderator, and colleagues. Thank you so much, Despina.
Not much to add. You said it all. Thank you to Arigato, to Suchi, dear Suchi, Maria Lucia, and Nico, Rita, Vera. Am I forgetting somebody? I hope not. It's been a joy working with you. We're concluding this series, but I think it's in fact a starting point, because the subject we have addressed is huge, long, as long as people have been alive, they're always wondering what living together means. I would like to thank also Kaisit, which made it possible for us to work. And because I'm half lead, that inspired, thank you, of course, I'm sorry, to Laura, to the participants, the presenters, it's been great. But since I'm half lead, it inspires me to end it with a quote from Casablanca. I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship in its extended version, meaning we hope that we can be able to collaborate in the future for further things to be brought into action and disseminated. Thank you so much, everybody. It's a great pleasure working with you and meeting all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye.